All right, yeah, thanks everybody for coming today. This is my 8th SDT conference. I was at the first one back in '99, and it's really changed a lot, I tell you what. I'm here today to talk about my book, which came out in November of '22. It's published by Basic Books, and it was actually written for a lay audience. Basic publishes works by notable scientists and tries to bring them to the general public. And one of the things that meant is that I had a really serious professional editor who did not let me get away with being boring and tedious and jargony. So it's a page turner. Everybody should buy the book. And so what I'm going to do is, it's not exactly SDT, but it's quite related to SDT, so I want to make some connections that might be interesting. My subtopic is the lingering power of the impoverished executive. This is something I've been interested in for a long time, that SDT shows how fragile intrinsic motivation is, how we can be thwarted in our needs, how we can be pursuing non-concordant goals. And the question is, are we just stuck when we are in a bad situation, or is there something we can do to escape from it? And so a lot of this talk will be about that question. All right, and I had that one come up first on this second slide because I wanted to remember to say that my publisher made a bunch of little cards that have discounts. So if you're interested in the book, you can pick up one of these cards and you can get the discount. And there's also some cards on the Guilford table. They let me put them there. All right, so my goals are to make some arguments for free will, and I'm not going to convince everybody. It's a very contentious issue, but I want to make it seem plausible, at least, that such a thing could be real. And I also want to show how free will connects to SDT, and it seems like a natural marriage in a way, because SDT is about the experience of autonomy, of acting with free will. So you'd think they fit right together. But from the point of view of determinism, there's no such thing as free will. And so autonomy must be an illusion. So maybe SDT is all about an illusion. I don't think that's the truth, and I'm actually going to suggest that the opposite is true. It's feeling controlled that's the illusion. Maybe. So it's kind of an interesting sell I'm going to try to do there. I'm going to talk about the definition of the self that I used in the book. It says what the new psychology of the self teaches us about how to live. It's consistent with the SDT self, but it's a little broader. It gets into identity and identity processes, and I want to show how that relates to the choices that we make in our goal pursuits. And I'm also going to present a concrete model of the free will process that we've been testing over the last couple of years to kind of bring it home, like how would this actually work? What is free will and how does it work? Well, here's this model, and we've supported it with data. We'll get to that at the end. We'll also talk about the neurological underpinnings of the model. I've been working with John Marshall and Reeve and Wugel Lee to bring together the neuroscience that supports this point of view that I'm going to present today. And I also want to talk about how even the most controlled self can find more satisfying ways to live. So the impoverished executive always has a chance to make a comeback and change things around in a radical way. All right, so I got started on this, and the pandemic came along and everything shut down, and what am I going to do? Well, why don't I write this book I've been thinking about for 30 years? And so I did, and pretty soon I found this book by Christian List that had just come out the last year. He's a philosopher, and his book was called Why Free Will is Real, and I said, yeah, that sounds good, I got to read that. And I did read it, and the more I read, the more I liked it, because he sidestepped all these philosophical distinctions and conundrums that have been clogging up that field for decades, if you ask me, and he put it squarely in the field of psychology. In fact, he put it in the field of goal setting, which is what I've been studying my whole career. So free will and goal setting sounds cool. So his definition of free will is really not unusual in philosophy. It's a compatibilist perspective, which says that free will is given to us by mental intentions. And so in order to have free will, all you have to do is have the ability to have an executive process which can call forth behavioral alternatives to consider, can make a choice between them and form an intention, and can then get going to do something, to pursue that intention. When I first read that, I was like, what? That's all it is? That's so simple. But then I thought, a little more deeply maybe about it, and I thought, well, what more could you ask as a free agent than the capacity to think about what you want, make a choice, and then go do it? I mean, it's perfectly sensible in a way. And I also thought, I've been studying happiness for a long time and whether it can go up and whether gains in happiness can be sustained. And so the pursuit of happiness. People pursue goals that don't work. They don't make them happier. So, or they pursue goals that they don't achieve. They fail at the goals. So we're not guaranteed to succeed. We're just guaranteed to have the ability to try. And maybe we'll get somewhere. And we're also not guaranteed to make good choices. And this is the really tricky part. It gets into a lot of the meat of the book, what it means to make a good choice. Instead, we're like psychologists conducting experiments, but in our own personal lives. What works? What makes me feel like this is taking me where I want to go? What's making me feel good? It's satisfying my needs. And so from this point of view, the question isn't whether we are free or controlled. I'm saying we're free. The question is, are we able to use our free will wisely? And that's a developmental process that we're all working on our entire lives. And if you think about it, these three assumptions, compatibilist philosophy, which basically says that a materialism, physical world is compatible with the subjective world of choices and intentions, we couldn't get by without this assumption in psychology. It underlays so much of what we do. Goal theory and goal research, that's what I've been doing a long time, self-regulation theory, executive process theory, Peter Goldwitzer's Rubicon theory, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. You just couldn't do psychology without having these three assumptions that Christian List laid out. So I loved that I had a philosopher on my side because it gave me cover against a lot of the kinds of criticisms that one can face. And then when I looked around more, it turns out that this is not at all a minority view. It's a majority view amongst professional philosophers that you can have a physical universe and psychological free will at the same time. Only 9% of professional philosophers, according to this survey, believe in determinism, which is we never had a choice. You were always going to be nodding your head or shaking your head or whatever it was, and I was always going to be having these noises come out of my mouth. No, there was choices all the way along. And so this is a little complicated, but this is sort of the basis for my argument, one of the main bases. It's a hierarchical conception of the organization of matter. And so you start with atoms, that's all there is, right? Nothing but atoms, but somehow it gets organized. You end up with molecules, and then you cross the gap to living cells, and then you have multiple multicellular organisms, and on all the way up until you get up to culture. And my point is, this is not just abstract. This is the facts. This is, it's at this particular moment, time t, instead of that guy shooting the basketball, it's Ken Sheldon giving a talk. Why is he doing that? Well, we could look at all these different levels and we could figure out, which one is most important. So you can kind of look at three groups here. There's the wetware, atoms up to organ tissues, and then there's sort of the software, which I would put the brain in with that. And then there's the socialware, you could call it. And we're all nested inside of relationships and cultures and norms, but we're also sort of in our own personality, our mental worlds. We have a certain degree of top-down control over what's going on down in the wetware. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So where's a natural place for free will? As a personality psychologist, I like the idea that it's at the level of personality processes. And remember, that's what Christian List was talking about, the executive capacity to ask yourself a question, get answers, and make a choice about what you want to do next. And so I think that's, it's just kind of just the way it feels for the most part. There's a lot of caveats, but we're all sort of making it up as we go along, deciding what to do next. Okay, just a few things about this multi-level hierarchy perspective. The lower levels supply building blocks. You couldn't have anything without atoms, and then they form molecules, and then you couldn't have anything else without those, and so on all the way up until you end up with these incredibly high-level complex processes where cultural forces are drifting through giant populations of brains and having their own effects. So the higher levels emerge from the lower levels, but they have a certain degree of independence and a certain degree of ability to downwardly cause what happens. The action is slower as you go up the hierarchy. So atomic processes, billions, every second. Cultural processes change very slowly. Personality processes are kind of pretty far up there, so they're slow. And so that might give you pause about free will. If they show up last on the scene, how could they exert free will? And I'll talk about how I think that can happen. One of the main arguments against free will is the reductionist perspective, which says you might think you did it, but really it was your brain that did it, but really it was your cells that did it, and really it was the atoms that did it, right? So that's what the reductionistic perspective says. I think that only makes sense when there's a problem at the lower levels of the system. So, if you have sickle cell anemia, your blood system doesn't work right. The constituents of the blood system mess up with the functioning of that system. Tumor in your brain, you can't think straight. A team of 5 basketball players, one of them is selfish, they can't play right. So everything has to be working well for these top-down effects to work. And I think behavior can be affected by every level, although particular levels might dominate, for particular behaviors. If I go to the refrigerator and get some food out, that's probably a hunger pang, but it might be some sort of unmet compensatory need that I'm trying to deal with. And so what we need to do from this perspective is develop giant multi-level prediction models that we can keep evaluating and improving until we can get to the point, maybe, of predicting whether that guy in that basketball game at that moment took the shot or instead passed it off to the next player. And that's really what we're trying to do. And I really think it's impossible because of free will in part. But we can get better and better. And I think that's what our goal should be. And so mental intentions, this is Christian List's proposal, they have this unique place in the hierarchy because they are in charge of determining where the body goes, not how it goes. That's where you need physiology and you need brain science to understand how it works. But once you're trying to figure out where it goes, you need psychology. And so here's an example. When I turn my car, when I get to I-70, Interstate 70 in my hometown of Columbia, Missouri, I either go left towards Kansas City, I go right towards St. Louis. It's entirely dependent on the attention that's in my mind, unless I space out and go the wrong way. But the point is, it's based on intentions. Maybe you can reduce that down to something lower, fine, good luck with that. I think you can have the best luck with it if there's a problem in the system. The person can't concentrate, they can't do whatever. All right, so how do we get this strange situation where slower arriving phenomenon that are more complicated and organized can have causal efficacy? They're last on the scene. How can they cause things? They work through control processes. And there's nothing mysterious about this. It's negative feedback loops. There's a standard. Way down low in the machinery, the standard is pre-programmed. Keep the body temperature at 98.6 Fahrenheit. We don't have any free will there, but at each level up, the standards control what goes on down lower on. And so, down in the cells, we couldn't have cells until you had a membrane that could regulate what could come in and what had to go out and keep the balance right. You couldn't have a multicellular organism until it could regulate the overall blood system with organs like kidneys. Cognitive level of organization is where our mental software goes into the brain for answers to the problems that it's trying to solve. Personality level, this is where I'm saying free will is located, is where broad life goals, things that we have, objectives, long-term futures in mind, can regulate the behavioral sequences that we engage in. So, I've been planning for this conference, like many of us, for a couple of years, and a lot of things have led up to this moment for all of us, and those things came out of the goals that we had in mind for this experience. But it doesn't stop there, because obviously the social psychologists and sociologists would tell us that there's lots of forces acting down on us. And so the action is, again, it's homeostatic at lower levels. There's no free will when we decide, what temperature to keep our body at. But as we go higher up, there's more and more degrees of freedom and more flexibility. And another thing about these mental intentions which drive our behavior is they're not just intentions, they are infused with self. And so here's an unusual looking fellow. We're not going to understand him by looking at his atoms or his chemistry or his neurons or his brain structure. We need to know who he thinks he is and who he feels he is, and why that seemed like a good way to express that. And so how do we connect this to SDT? An obvious way to do it is to say that SDT has always been concerned with the interface between the person and the social world, especially high-low power relationships. So high authorities can control us, and that can be a problem. They can undermine our intrinsic motivation and a lot more. So SDT wants to help us fit better and elicit better conditions from our social world so we can function better. But this is getting back to the impoverished executive. What if your situation's terrible and it's not really going to change? And there's many people around the world who exist in way worse circumstances than any of us experience. Can they do anything about it, or are they just helpless victims? And this might be controversial, I'm not sure, it might not. I said earlier that maybe it's the feeling of being controlled that's the illusion, not the feeling of being autonomous. And I think it's always our brains choosing. Our brains are choosing what to do next. It's indisputable. Even though we may not have our integrated sense of self involved in that choice process. But that doesn't mean that we're relieved of responsibility. So the situation made me do it is a classic external motivation item. Try saying that if you're on trial for war crimes because you followed your corporal's orders and you shot the person you shouldn't have shot, right? We hold people accountable to go against what the social situation is telling them, even when it might cost them their lives. And so I don't think we can say, I was controlled, I had to do it. I think we're always free to do what we want, and the problem is we may not have enough courage to do what we believe is right, or we may not have enough insight to make good choices. So if you buy into this, it's kind of an existential perspective, the Viktor Frankl perspective that you're always free to choose, and you can hide from that fact. Escape from Freedom, Eric Fromm's book, was all about that we're afraid of freedom. And it makes sense because, if you're responsible, you're making the choices, you got nobody to blame if it goes wrong. But I think that we just have to kind of suck it up. And, we all have variations in how bad our situations are, but we're all responsible to do the best we can given those situations. All right, so what is the self? In SDT, the self is the center of integrative assimilatory activity. And that makes sense, but I wanted to use a slightly elaborated version of self that includes identity, because I think this can tell us a lot about the choices people make in their lives. And so I like this conception of symbolic self, first proposed by Sedekides and Skowronski back in 1997. It's the capacity to kind of create and live inside of a person in the world who has feelings and a history and goals and intentions and wants things to go well. We're all living inside of something like that. Some people are living inside of more than one. I was just reading an article about what used to be called multiple personality disorder. That's a real thing. They have too many symbolic selves. So I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but they say that the symbolic self involves a third order form of awareness where you're not just thinking about me reaching for the mic or not just thinking about how I look to you, but you're thinking about yourself as a character playing their part in an ongoing drama that lasts a long time. And they also argue that this is an evolved function, involved capacity of human beings to create and live inside of this symbolic self, and we had to be able to do it once we had language because social influence got a whole lot harder. We had to be able to convince people that we were legitimate and real and could be trusted, and we had to kind of develop a sense of self in order to do that as effectively as possible. So they talk about three functions of the symbolic self to make a pretty good argument. The first function is playing the person's part in the social world. You know, we talk to each other and we're each kind of, you know, negotiating, going back and forth, and so forth. We want to do a good job of that. The second function is to serve as the executive in the person's action system, and that's what Christian List was talking about, the free will capability to make decisions. And the third function is to protect and defend the structure of the self. And didn't talk about that as much in the book, but I think it becomes very relevant when people are stuck pursuing a goal that they don't really want. Actually, I will get to that at the very end of my talk here. And I also think there's a fourth function that I've argued for in several places, which is to accurately represent in consciousness what's going on down deeper. And of course, that's a skill, and there's a lot of things that can get in the way of it. But you can't really make good choices unless you can do that, unless you know what you're feeling. Integrative emotion regulation is one way to talk about that. So the symbolic self, some people ask me, you know, is this like some kind of a homunculus in the mind, a little man in the head? And no, it's not. It's just a fiction. It's a model. It's a construction. There's no soul. I mean, sure, maybe there is. I would like if there were, but... So in a sense, we are like ghosts in our own machines. But that doesn't mean what we're doing isn't important, because thinking that we're a self has a lot of implications. It affects the kinds of choices that we make in our lives. Maybe we get a full body tattoo because that's what we think we need to do to express ourselves to other people. And in cybernetic control theory terms, Carver and Shire's being or self-level goals, these enduring, long strivings can make a big difference on the behaviors that we perform. So it's the personality process affecting the mental intentions. All right, so then the book segues into this question of how do we make wise choices? And I argue that our real problem is that we have too much freedom. It's not that we don't have enough freedom. We have too much. We're kind of cut off from our implicit underpinnings, and we don't know enough to make good choices. So we live in kind of an imaginary world. We're building models of ourselves. We keep doing it. We try new ones. We can't just be ourselves directly like a cat, or maybe some of us can. For me, anyway, that would be hard. And we're the only animal that commits suicide. And that tells me the power of the symbolic self to just decide I'm worthless, I need to leave the universe. And so you can talk about this in System 1, System 2 terms, that the goal-choosing, intention-choosing self is writing down a goal on a sheet of paper. They're typing a goal into a text box. That's a verbal process. But, you know, as words don't, they can misrepresent, they can be totally off base. We may have no idea what the right answer is for what we should be going after. In motivation research, this is reflected by implicit, explicit discrepancies. Our self-concepts can be, you know, way off base with who we are in some deeper way. This is one of my favorite quotes. Starting to run out of time, so I won't get into it, but it's a cool quote. It basically says we're all just kind of drifting along in our heads without much of a rudder, or maybe we can find an inner compass, as Aviasor would say. So in this account of free will, Christian List didn't tell us what a wise choice was. He just said, choice, we can choose. So a lot of my research over the years has looked at this concept of self-concordance, which I measure by asking people, why are you choosing this goal? Why are you pursuing this goal using a relative autonomy continuum? And surprisingly, people will write down goals, blank sheet of paper, and then say, I don't want it. I don't believe in it. I don't enjoy it. Why would they do that? Because it doesn't fit them. And I've done a bunch of studies where you randomly assign people to a goal type, and if it's one that doesn't objectively fit their personality, then they feel less concordant. So it really is a measure of person-goal fit. And this is a model we published 25 years ago almost that shows that it matters that you feel autonomous in the goals you pursue. It helps you keep going longer because the goals express something that's real in there, that's not just your momentary mental construction, and that'll get your needs met and it'll improve your well-being. Okay, so how can we learn to use our free will better? Several techniques that I've looked at or other people have looked at. I think mindfulness meditation is a great way to put aside your self-concept and preconceptions and be open to what's actually bubbling up out of there. You can make a point of going with your gut. The Missouri student Chad Burton did his dissertation on this, and it made a difference. We can ask people who know us what we should do. We may be confused, but they may have insights that we don't know about. We can think about why we would do something before we cross the Rubicon to doing that something. Actually I talked about this at the 2016 conference, this research where ask yourself, why would I want to do A, and why would I want to do B, and why would I want to do C? And pick the one that you want to do. I mean, it's kind of obvious. We can weight or revisit our choices. This is research on the organismic valuing process. We did quite a ways. We can get older. Getting older, getting better. We had a paper like that where the point was that the older you got, the more self-concordant you were in your choices. You knew what you liked. You were resistant to pressure. You've learned through experience. All right, this is next to last slide, but there's a lot on here, so I'm going to walk you through it 3 different times. This is called the goal breakthrough model. This is our model of free will, or one form of free will. And it's a model that explains how you can escape from a bad condition. So the first time, I'll just say that this is just a classic creative stage model. The creator's got a problem, he's trying to come up with a solution. He thinks and thinks, that's preparation. He gives up, or she gives up. At some point, that's the incubation phase, and then at some point, some insight will just pop into their heads, and they'll recognize that's the solution, and then they'll cross the Rubicon, in Peter Gollwitzer's terms, to pursuing a goal. So really, those first 4 boxes are about the deliberation process in Gollwitzer's Rubicon, or action phases model. He only had 1 box. We got 4 boxes. Okay, second time through. Instead of applying it to creativity, let's apply it to goal selection. I'm dissatisfied. Maybe for decades you're dissatisfied. Finally you get to the point of asking yourself, what's wrong? What do I want? What should I do? That's critical. It's an executive process that activates the non-conscious mind to start providing you with possible solutions. And it may take a while for those solutions to emerge. It might take months or more. But eventually you'll hopefully get the idea, and then you have to have the courage to cross the Rubicon and pursue the new goal. So this shows how you're stuck in a place, you're doing something you hate, or you're doing something you feel you have to do, and you can figure out the alternative that you really want to do instead. And I don't have the time to go into the neuroscience underpinnings, but it fits pretty well. In this article that Woogle, John Marshall, and I just completed, we said SDT ties in at least these 2 ways, that intrinsic motivation, you don't feel it in what you're doing, the thing you're dissatisfied with, but if you're getting some of it elsewhere, that can energize you, can also suggest other avenues that you might turn to. So intrinsic motivation remains critical, and of course autonomy support is extremely important. And this is something we're researching right now. an underappreciated or unrecognized aspect of autonomy support. So usually it's about, asking nicely and so forth. Last slide. But what if the authority can teach the subordinates, the students, to ask themselves what they want? I think this is a critical habit that we can all develop. We feel stuck and we don't know what to do and we're just kind of helpless, but just start to ask yourself what you want, and that executive process will help. And that's where free will exists, in my opinion. When the executive process says, I'm sick of this, I want to do something about it, what? And that activates the implicit mind. And the second place is when you say, wow, that's a great idea, I wonder if I should do that. Yes, I'm going to have the courage to cross the Rubicon, I'm going to change my life. Thank you very much.